Pretty quick start of this because we have a little bit to get through and we need to end by 10 o'clock at the latest so we get the camera set up at the church. Here we are. This is the fourth forum, the fifth week of You Redeemed, and it is the final week of our program. We're bringing everything together in this last week, and the title of today's talk is St. Paul, St. Matthew's, and St. You, which I just think is very witty. And the idea is that, well, you know, we look about being open to God is kind of what sainthood's about, but we do this by baby steps, right? You don't have to be intimidated by it. It's just baby steps, just gradual opening of ourselves to God's plan for us. Where we've been this whole Lent program is getting used to the idea is that the way God redeems our past is by taking all that is good and beautiful and all that is ugly and sometimes bad and using that to convert us into the world with love and to create more love in the world through us. So we spent time recalling our lives, casting our minds back and thinking about those years we've had alive. We spent some time looking at our lives from God's point of view, and some of you found that a very interesting exercise. And all along we've been entertaining this idea that what God does is he takes what isn't quite so well in our lives and he makes it well by making it the means by which we connect more compassionately, I say more emphatically, with the world around us. So God takes what is not well and uses it to help us connect with the world, to create more love. A slightly more redeemed self. So ever so slightly more redeemed, Betty liked that, will be more whole as your strengths and weaknesses come together and you're more coordinated. You're not trying to hide all your hurt and your weakness behind you and just try to be the good part of you, but there's a kind of a wholeness. You can bring those two together. A slightly, ever so slightly more redeemed self, I think will be less scared and less fearful and less of a problem to itself because there's more self-acceptance happening. And a slightly more redeemed self will be more able to act compassionately, spontaneously in the moment it finds itself in. And that came out of the Thursday small group Zoom discussion where people were like not signing up for brand new ministries, like I really want to go now to Burundi or something and be a missionary of the gospel, but just this sense that because of this work they had done in this program, they were spontaneously just more capable of compassion in the moments that their lives brought them. And I would say the last part of being a slightly more redeemed self is that you might take more savor and get more strength from prayer, from being open to the mystery that God is, and finding support and love and strength in that. So today we're going to do three things. We're going to look at one part of unwellness, which is sin. It's kind of a spiritual unwellness and how God redeems that, looking at St. Paul. We're going to wonder momentarily about how this all might work as part of a parish community, which Yvonne suggested in the first week was we redeemed, right? St. Matthew's as a parish being redeemed. And then the bulk of the program is going to be St. You. See, isn't that cute? I think it's very cute. And this will involve us beginning this last final wonder about how God might be acting now to redeem me just a little bit more, just to open us a little bit more to God's life in the world. And that's all I want, is this beginning kind of opening wonder about that. And today we have with us Julia Sendor, and you can move the camera, Sam. This is just like TV. And many of you know Julia from JU. I've invited Justice United in Orange County. I've invited Julia here today because the way that Justice United grows leaders in communities, often unused to leadership, or having a voice. Like, think of people in trailer homes learning to be leaders and gatherers and speakers for their community. And the way they do this in a more secular context is by helping people see how their personal stories, both the moments of grace and the moments of where they've experienced the profound unwellness of the world, are the basis for their commitment and their action for love in the world. I think is that pretty good?
Yeah, I'm done.
And so,
Thank you.
so what I found is, like, I have this theology which comes from St. Paul and other things in my life about how human beings are turned over to God's action in the world. And then I found this paralleled in the leadership development that Justice United does, again in a more secular context. I find that fascinating, and that's why I asked Julie to come and help me out today. Also gives me 15 minutes off, which is great. Why don't we say a brief prayer before we begin, the prayer for St. Paul. The Lord be with you. O God, by the preaching of your Apostle Paul, you have caused the light of the gospel to shine throughout the world. Grant, we pray, that we, having his wonderful conversion in remembrance, may show ourselves thankful to you by following his holy teaching. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So we all know who St. Paul was. Yeah, for sure. We can all debate which letters were written by St. Paul, but that's for the seminarians to work on.
Still working on it.
All right, good job, Sam. Good job. Ephesians? Okay, all right. So, St. Paul was born about the time of Jesus, between 5 BCE and 5 CE, devout Jewish family in Tarsus. He was a devout Pharisee. And Paul knew what he was about. He studied under one of the most significant scholars of the time, Gamaliel, probably, I think, in Jerusalem. He was also, as we know, a violent persecutor of the church. When we first encounter St. Paul, he is watching, holding the coats of us. He's holding the coats of the men who are busy stoning St. Stephen. And he's looking on with approval, because what he did, he thought, he was totally certain that Christianity was an abomination and a violation of everything he stood for. So he went around persecuting, jailing, standing by as Christians were killed. So we might say that is a little bit sinful. But he engaged in that fundamental thing of, like, sacrificial violence, of being violent against another, but also he was going directly against. Yep, it's good. All right. Going directly against God's desire. So we all know that St. Paul had a conversion experience. And we all know, right, that there was no horse. Very good. Now you know. There's no horse in the story. Everybody says there's a horse, but there was no horse. Isn't that right, Sam?
I didn't know that.
Okay. There was no horse.
I need a minute.
But if we look at this conversion story, I'm going to do this pretty quickly. He had this moment of penetrating and shocking truth, which is that for all his zeal for God and his certainty, he had been entirely and totally wrong. He had been persecuting God in the person of Jesus. And this penetrating truth demanded from him a humility. And it's funny how when Jesus confronts him with this truth, he also is like, Paul, I'm also going to send you to be my apostle. Jesus isn't like, Paul, you were really bad and I'm tired of it and you got to stop and just pipe down. His way of loving Paul was to give him a mission. And I personally kind of think about that a lot. Give him a mission to do something in the world, to be his new preacher for the world. And I think this experience of being confronted with the truth of his profound, absolute, horrible wrongness, and being loved, and being sent to make communities, right, had the penny drop for Paul. Like, oh my gosh, God's people, this new community, is constituted by people who accept this, that God's faithfulness and love for them goes all the way through suffering and death and becoming sin for them. So accept God's faithfulness around the person of Jesus. And there are people who attempt to live from this as a basis for their self-worth. Self-worth based on the fact that God loves everybody. That means you too. And God also sends you meaningfully into the world. I think those two things have to stay together. It's not enough to, I think, just to say that God loves us and accepts us. That's the first step. It converts over into God loving you so much that he wants to share God's life with you in the world and send you out into the world for that. So, Paul was a sinner, a really big sinner. He got it entirely wrong. And the way that love redeemed that is they took all of Paul's learning, his connections, his rhetorical skills, all that he developed in his life as a Jew, as a Pharisee, and turned it over through the weakness of having been entirely, totally wrong and a murderer in his wrongness, to go out and make a new kind of community that is about God's love for you regardless, or God's grace for you regardless. And this is the weird thing, that like God's using of our sin to make us more aware of God's constant loving of us, so that we can begin to relate on the basis of that constant loving of us. Right? That's just an example of how God uses sin, evil, destructive, homicidal hatred to create love. By calling Paul into a state of humility, that he has nothing. And in the reading we'll have for today in church, I was circumcised on the 8th day, Paul says. I was a member of the people of Israel, a tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew, born of Hebrews, a Pharisee, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. Whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss. All those assets of self-worth, loss, because of Christ. And more than that, I regard everything as lost because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ my Lord, the new self based around Christ. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things. We could do a lot more with St. Paul, and I want to do a lot more with St. Paul, but we got to make room for the really exciting thing about this program, which is St. You. And because actually this You Redeemed works on the basis of your work you do with yourself and with each other. It's the activities, not the forums, that are going to change your life. That sounded very evangelical, didn't it? But it's the reflective praying process you do on your own that changes you, not the forum. So we're just kind of setting up that reflective process today. A brief note about St. Matthew's. We've been on this journey about our private lives, our personal lives, what's good and bad in our lives, and how that might be redeemed, and God using the past to create more love, right? That's what we've been about. Just step back for a moment and be like, oh, we're going to be looking at the history of St. Matthew's in the next couple years as we get to our bicentennial, and we're going to find grace and love and fantastic stuff there, and great strengths in the community. And we're going to find sin, because guess what? We're all human, right? We're going to find very difficult sin there too. And the question is, he's going to be, how might God use that past sin to humble us, like St. Paul, and to open us to this world with greater compassion and love now? And then we become part of the redeeming of that history as we allow it to change us and make us more compassionately open to the world as we are now. I think that's pretty powerful. So St. Paul, very quickly. St. Matthew's, again, very quickly, and going back. Even that can be redeemed, Hayes. I can't believe you said a curse word in a Sunday forum. I worked in a kitchen, Hayes, and I learned all the bad stuff when I was 18. Still have a mouth that's not too clean. There is no match found.
Can't figure out how to operate this thing.
So I want to move quickly, though, to Julia, who will help us what I'm calling the big wonder of this program, like an imaginative experiment with how might God redeem just a bit of your life as it is now to convert you to more love in the world. Over to you. You can either clip it on, or you can leave it right there.
Well, good morning. I'm really thankful to be here with all of you. As Robert said, I'm Julia Sendor, and I am the community organizer with the group Orange County Justice United. And I also recognize some of you. I got to know some of you through my years as the farmer and director at Anatoth Community Garden and Farm. So it's good to be back here again in another way. And some of you also know my mom, who is Liz Dowling Sendor. So thankful to be sort of in her footsteps here as well. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to share for myself personally and also through the Justice United perspective why this idea of redemption and this activity, this lifelong activity of the big wonder really resonates so deeply. And I am going to be reading some from my notes, one because I have a baby, and and two because I was up way past my bedtime last night and then up a little while longer because I was so happy and excited. Couldn't get to sleep.
Be careful, Julie, this is a divided crowd.
I know that I stand in the truth and the light or something like that. So I have no fear. So in organizing, this is actually maybe relevant, but I'll keep it out of basketball terminology, but it could be applied. In organizing in our work, we talk about this overarching framework, this way we see the world as this tension, this lifelong tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And in the world as it should be, which is the world of God's vision, which is the world that many of our sacred texts, regardless of your faith, invites us to envision, that's a world shaped by love. And everything in the world as it should be happens because of love. But we know that we live in the world as it is, where there's definitely joy, but there's also suffering. And there's pain that we receive and pain that we inflict. And there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of loss. But even though we don't live permanently in the world as it should be, we're not powerless. And we're also not alone. We're not without each other, and we're not without God. And even here in this imperfect world as it is, we believe that God inspires us to keep envisioning the world as it should be. And also, as Robert has described, to allow God to work through us as co-creators towards that vision. And in fact, if we were already in the world as it should be, there wouldn't be much to do. We could just lie back in a hammock and drink our sweet tea in total bliss. And interestingly, if we only lived in the world as it is, in the worst of the world as it is, with no hope for any kind of redemption at all, any experience, any chance of experiencing any piece of the world as it should be, there also wouldn't be much to do. We would have also no option but to be passive in a different way, not blissful, but just resigned. There would be no point in trying to take any kind of action. And we also wouldn't have been given these innate powers that we do have, these abilities that we do have to reflect and to envision and to imagine and to listen for where God is calling us and to act, again, to co-create with God and with each other. And so here we are. This is where we live, in this messy and, I believe, fruitful tension that's full of possibility between the world as it is and the world as we believe it should be. It's full of possibility for how we want to act, how we want to be guided by our vision for the world as it should be, how we want to act in ways, as Robert has said, that allow us and those we're in community with to be even a little bit more redeemed. And so how do we discern how we want to act? Today, again, is not a day to come up with definitive answer. I'm going to do X ministry for X hours a week, but to begin to imagine what that discernment could look like, to begin to imagine and begin to explore. And in organizing, and for me personally, believe that our own life stories, our own experiences are fundamental for that exploration. We believe that our life experiences profoundly shape who we are. They clarify our deepest longings, our dreams, and our motivations. And our own stories, if we take time to really reflect on them, both the painful ones and the joyful ones, can reveal what's driving us and how God is calling us. I've heard this described as our inner pilot light, our inner sense of purpose. I like that metaphor, and I also, Robert, in his outline that he sent me, used the word of flowing, of God's redemption flowing. And to follow that imagery, I also love the metaphor of this inner purpose as a kind of natural spring that's always bubbling up if you can only find it, where your own source of life and sustenance is ever flowing. So being able to identify deeply what drives you and then to live it out is a fundamental part of living a deeply meaningful life. And as Robert described, the beauty of it is also that the more clearly and vividly we understand our own selves and the experiences that have shaped us, the more we can actually connect with those around us. Like the deeper we go, the wider we can go. And that's why I also like this metaphor of this ever-bubbling natural spring, because it comes from a vast underground aquifer. And so the more deeply we're aware of our own pain and also our own experiences of joy, the more we can connect to this common aquifer of humanity, to all of this suffering and all of this joy and all of the imperfections and possibilities that we all share. And so my main work as an organizer is actually listening to people's stories. And it's to ask them questions that help them tromp through the woods of their own life experiences to understand where their own ever-bubbling springs are and maybe brush off the leaves with them until they can see how powerfully it's bubbling up. And then talk with them, walk with them, decide how they want to channel that innate ability they have to act, and to see if they're interested in working with other people to act together towards some kind of collective vision. And I'll briefly share some of my own story that has brought me to this place to be with you today. I'll try to make it as concise as possible. But I had my first experience of really coming up against the injustice of the world as it is when I was about 7 or 8 years old and waiting on the front porch for my dad to come home from work. And I saw him crumple with dejection out of the car. And some of you may know my dad spent his career as a public defender. And one of his clients was a man named Daryl Hunt, who was wrongfully convicted and spent 20 years in prison for a crime he had nothing to do with. And he was a black man, and the victim was a white woman. And the racial aspect was very played up in the media and in the court case. The whole handling of the case was horrific. One of the supposed eyewitnesses was a KKK member, and so on. And so he was wrongfully convicted. But 10 years into his prison sentence, DNA evidence became admissible in court. And I remember the day my dad came home celebrating, I think with a bottle of wine, that Daryl's DNA did not match the evidence and he was going to be free. And as little as I was, I knew this was a big deal, so excited. This is a big deal for our whole family. But that day I'm talking about on the porch, my dad came up the steps and told me he had bad news. They had appealed the case to a judge who had looked at the DNA evidence and said, I still think he's guilty. And so Daryl stayed in prison 10 more years until a team of people worked and worked and worked to finally get him exonerated. And I remember that day on the porch, I was so little, and I was so overwhelmed by the reality of the world as it is. I remember wanting to just kick out all the screens, which would not have helped my dad at all. But I was so angry. This is not the world I thought I had been born into. And I felt like at odds with the air around me. I couldn't believe that something this unfair could be allowed to exist, that it could be allowed to happen. And now that I've taken some time to reflect, I've realized that in that moment, there was born this determination in me to try to be a part of making the world more the way it should be. And at the same time, I was experiencing more of a version of the world as it should be with my friend Megan over at your fellow Episcopal Church, Holy Family in Chapel Hill. In the 1990s, it was a smaller, very tight-knit church, and everyone did everything together. When someone moved, all the members would help the people moving carry their boxes in and bless all the corners of the house with holy water, and then have a big potluck, and all the kids would race around the backyard together. And it really, sometimes it just so vividly felt like the world as it should be. Everyone's eyes open to celebrate God's light in each other. And now, years later, reflecting back, I realized during those years, this question began to form in me: how could the beauty and power of community that I saw in our church actually be a force for shaping the world closer to the way it should be, to be a little more redeemed? And my last story is that this is a great question. I thought I had now been sent with this mission, like St. Paul. Here I am, graduating college, ready to go off into the world to bring these two inspirations from my parents together. And in a somewhat self-righteous way, I moved to a tiny rural community in the mountains of southern West Virginia to work with a local community organization. And while I was there in 2009, almost exactly this time of year, there was a mine explosion in that same community that it was caused by the mine owner's intentional negligence, and it killed 29 miners. And there are really no words to describe the depth of this loss and this pain. And I was in total shock. The night of the explosion, I went to the one restaurant in town. I was friends with the owners, and everyone was pouring into the restaurant in shock, and we spent the whole night baking biscuits for the rescue workers and for the families of the miners who were waiting at the entrance of the mine to see if there were any survivors. And I spent the whole night baking the biscuits and frying eggs side by side with a guy my own age exactly, who had finished his shift in the mine and made it out, unbeknownst to him at that point in time, 45 minutes before the explosion. And so he was crying, and I was listening and crying, and that is a whole story, the story of those families and of the people who cared about those who lost their lives and of those who lost their lives. And then for my own story, it was completely demoralizing for myself, for both the tragedy of the overall incident, and I realized I had no idea how to make a difference in the world. I didn't feel like any of the community work I was doing was having much traction. And here I was faced against this huge, huge injustice, the explosion and all the layers of injustice and poverty that were surrounding it. And I just felt totally paralyzed and stuck. And it wasn't as extreme a sin as St. Paul. I didn't murder people. I didn't do all of those things. But to me, it was such a dark time. I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know if I even had my own light anymore. I didn't know how to use it. And it felt like this weirdest, most subtle, shameful sin, like a sin directly against God, any kind of vision God might have for me or for what I might do in the world. It was this sense of shame, failure, and guilt, and I was really homesick. And it was really humbling in the sense that it knocked me to the ground. For minutes for people to reflect on your own, of how the stories you've been going over in your life have brought you close to the experience of the pain of the world as it is, and also to the beauty of the world as it should be. And then we'll take 3 or 4 minutes where you can talk to the person next to you, or if you're on Zoom, Sam, I believe, will put you in breakout groups of 2 and share those stories with each other. And then we'll all return back to the end.
So what is the assignment now, Julia?
So the assignment is to take 3 minutes and reflect in your own life of where you have experienced this sense of suffering and pain in the world, and the imperfection of the world as it is, and where you've also experienced the taste of the world as it should be. And then after 3 minutes, you'll share with each other.
If I could call you all back, come on back. I'll encourage you to continue having these conversations outside before the service. Grab some coffee cake and some grapes and have a chat with each other. People are coming back on Zoom. I am audible. And if we could just come back to the basic meeting, I got like 5 minutes. So I want to talk about the invitation into the big wonder which is the homework for this week. And again, the magic of this program is in the time of reflection and prayer you make with yourself with these questions, and then the conversations you have with each other. Now, if you've done none of that reflection this entire Lent, that's entirely okay. You can really jump into this last week and it will still work, I think, for you. When we're working with intuition and prayer and imagination, it's something that needs many times around the loop. Like you climb the mountain, you come down the mountain. You climb the mountain, you come down the mountain, and gradually you get that sense of where God might be, inviting you to step out just a little bit in your life. You can't just think it right away, but you can imagine it, intuit it, be open to it, and then come down the mountain, and then go back up, talk to each other. That's where the magic is. So the homework for this week is something that I sort of thought about, and whenever I invite people to do reflective questions, I try them out on myself. I'm like a little guinea pig for myself. Does it work? What happens to me with it? And this week's big wonder is actually, I think, really powerful. So that I want to sort of step you through it now so that you're ready for it when you get the email tonight that sort of prompts you for these reflections. The first question is to go back and just write out on a map or a list or however you do it, like the places of strength in your life. And when I did that, it kind of coalesced around relational strengths, like my marriage. Hi, Jane. And Jane herself and the kids and this parish and the friendships I have. There's like relational strengths which ground and support me. There's like gifts that I have around like thinking and talking and feeling, which I find are part of my strength. There's like a long history in Christianity that I have and like spiritual practice. Like that's the kind of a bizarre strength that I have. And like, well, that's kind of interesting. And like social strengths, like I have a platform. I'm a rector in a parish. That's like a social strength, right? That's a status. And I'm also known by the bishop, and I'm liked in the diocese. And so all these, I am. It's true. Hard to believe, but true. But all these are like strengths that I have in my life. And then the next question is kind of about like what moves you in the world right now? And it can be anything. But I'm asking you to focus on what moves you like locally. Like you think about Ukraine, yes, right? But what moves you, what moves your heart to pity or compassion in what you experience in your lives here in the triangle, right? As you go through your life, what tends to trigger a sense of, oof, a little compassionate connection? What does that for you where you are now? You write about those. And in each of these steps, it's like write about it, give thanks, write about it, maybe pray and ask God for some help with that or some connection with that. And this, I think, this is the big question. We've done a lot of work with our pasts, right? This question is about the present. This is where we get into the actual present of your life now. What in your life now needs redeeming? It's a big question. So you don't worry about what happened to you, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but right now, what needs redeeming? And I discovered in myself there was some senses, some ways that I am that aren't quite right, that aren't quite full of life. And I was like, ugh, how could that ever be redeemed? It's like, huh. And it was more subtle with me. It wasn't like I was out persecuting Christians or anything, but, it was more subtle. And I was like, it was really cool to touch into that. And it could be that, for instance, you've moved to a continuing care facility or continuing care community recently, and you feel more lonely. That loneliness needs to be redeemed. It could be that you're missing somebody in your life because of the pandemic. Well, that needs to be redeemed. It could be that you're feeling a bit adrift or too distracted or something. How might God redeem that part of your life now? And you write these down. And the last question is, how might God respond to you? So again, imagining yourself in God's shoes just for a moment, and even writing something from God to you in response. As you've asked God, I think this needs a little redeeming. How might God receive that? given that you also have these strengths and these ways of connecting with the world that are kind of instinctive to you. It might not make a whole lot of sense now. It might seem like a whole lot of jargon, like, oh my God, yet more exercises to do. I have that same reaction. When anybody says spiritual exercise, I'm like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. But then I do it, I'm like, I had no idea this stuff was there. And it opened up stuff for me that I'm like, whoa, I need to pay attention to this, put it away, and come back to it later, and then come back to it again. It's kind of this kind of process. So that's the big wonder. I'm calling that the big wonder for this week. And it's just about having this conversation with God about how God might work with your strengths and what needs redeeming to connect you with the world right now. And then you share that in your companion things and your small groups, and then we head into Holy Week. That's pretty dramatic. It's a pretty big shift. And then, as I said, this is just the start. We're not solving all of this. If you do want to go and be a missionary to Burundi, let me know. I can arrange that. It could lead to a new sense of ministry in the church. You could be like, I really feel like God's leading me to this children's ministry or to a prayer ministry or to a working more with OCIM in the soup kitchen. It could lead to this or this or this. But right now we're not jumping to those conclusions. We're trying to open the ground and see where God might be in this and let God take the lead. So thank you for being a part of this forum. Thank you for being a part of You Redeemed. I believe in sometime in May, I might call us all back together for a last conversation after Easter. Come back to all of this. But for right now, this is the last week, and thank you for being part of it. I will see you around. And thank you, Sam, for video, and thank you, Julia, for talking today.